Moscow, October 18, 1977. Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Pavlovich Lysenko stood in the Meteorological Command Center beneath the Ministry of Defense, watching radar screens track a massive storm system approaching from the Urals. Around him, technicians monitored atmospheric pressure readings, wind velocities, and cloud formations with the precision of missile launch coordinators. But they weren't preparing for war. They were preparing to wage war against the weather itself. Through encrypted communications, Lysenko could hear pilots confirming their positions. 6 Tupolev Tu-16 bombers circling at 12,000 meters, their bellies loaded not with nuclear weapons, but with silver iodide canisters and liquid nitrogen dispensers. "Commence Operation Clear Sky," he ordered into his headset, his voice steady despite the weight of what they were attempting. The aircraft began their runs, releasing clouds of silver iodide into the storm's heart. Lysenko had read the American intelligence reports, dismissed as paranoid fantasies by his superiors, suggesting that the Soviet Union was developing weather control capabilities that could devastate NATO harvests, flood European military installations, or create artificial droughts in the American Midwest. The Americans were half right. The USSR was manipulating weather, but not for the apocalyptic scenarios Washington imagined. They were doing something the West thought impossible, systematically controlling precipitation across 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. What neither Lysenko nor his American counterparts fully grasped that October evening was that this Soviet weather modification program would become one of the Cold War's most ambitious and ultimately most problematic technological competitions, revealing how the superpowers' obsession with controlling everything would lead them to attempt mastery over nature itself. The idea that weather could be weaponized or controlled captured Cold War imaginations on both sides of the Iron Curtain with an intensity that today seems almost mystical. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as both superpowers raced to develop hydrogen bombs and intercontinental missiles, weather modification emerged as another frontier where technological supremacy might be demonstrated. Soviet atmospheric scientist Yevgeny Konstantinovich Fyodorov declared in a 1949 presentation to the Academy of Sciences that the transformation of nature, including atmospheric processes, represents the highest achievement of socialist science in service to the people. His vision aligned perfectly with Stalin's obsession with grand technological projects that would showcase Soviet superiority. The thinking was straightforward. If the USSR could control weather, it could protect its vast agricultural territories, support military operations regardless of conditions, and demonstrate mastery over natural forces that capitalist science could only observe helplessly. American concerns about Soviet weather manipulation grew exponentially after World War II. A 1947 CIA assessment noted that Soviet atmospheric research stations across Siberia exceed any legitimate meteorological requirements and may serve dual purposes. The paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. The Soviets were investing heavily in atmospheric research, establishing hundreds of meteorological stations across their territory, with capabilities far beyond simple weather forecasting. Captain Howard T. Orville, chairman of the U.S. Advisory Committee on Weather Control, warned Congress in 1956 that the nation which first learns to plot the paths of air masses accurately and learns to control the time and place of precipitation will dominate the globe. Senator Hubert Humphrey echoed this concern, stating that weather modification could be a more effective weapon than the H-bomb. The strategic logic seemed inescapable. Control the weather, control food production, control food production, control nations. Soviet confidence in weather modification stemmed partly from genuine scientific advances. In 1946, American scientist Vincent Schaefer had successfully demonstrated cloud seeding using dry ice, proving that human intervention could trigger precipitation. Soviet scientists, operating with essentially unlimited state funding and access to vast territories for experimentation, believed they could scale these techniques to unprecedented levels. Pyotr Kapitsa, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, suggested that socialist planned economy allows for atmospheric planning on scales impossible under capitalism's chaotic market forces. The initial American response mixed skepticism with alarm. A 1958 National Security Council memo concluded that while Soviet claims of weather control capabilities likely exceed their actual achievements, the strategic implications of even partially successful weather modification require immediate U.S. development of equivalent capabilities. The document revealed the Cold War's essential dynamic. Regardless of whether something was actually possible, if your adversary claimed they could do it, you had to assume they could and respond accordingly. By the early 1960s, both sides had committed substantial resources to weather modification research. The Soviets established the Institute of Experimental Meteorology in Obninsk, dedicating hundreds of scientists to the problem. The Americans launched Project Storm Fury, attempting to weaken hurricanes, and later would deploy weather modification extensively in Vietnam under Operation Popeye. Each side's investments reinforced the other's paranoia, creating a feedback loop of escalating programs and increasingly grandiose claims. The Soviet weather modification program's roots traced back to the desperate years of World War II, when Soviet scientists first explored using artillery shells filled with silver iodide to disperse fog around airfields, allowing bombers to take off during the siege of Leningrad. These crude attempts proved marginally effective, but they planted a seed. If you could disperse fog, perhaps you could do far more. After the war, Stalin ordered the establishment of what would become known as the Main Geophysical Observatory, tasking it with investigating all possibilities for atmospheric intervention in service of Soviet agriculture and military capabilities. The initial focus was practical: protecting crops from hail, reducing frost damage, and ensuring adequate rainfall for collective farms. Academician Yevgeny Fedorov, appointed director of the new Hydrometeorological Service in 1947, assembled a team of meteorologists, physicists, and chemists who would spend the next 3 decades pushing the boundaries of what humans could do to the sky. The breakthrough came in 1954, when Soviet scientists, building on American cloud seeding techniques, successfully triggered rainfall over a 50-square-kilometer area near Stavropol, using aircraft-dispersed silver iodide. The experiment, codenamed Operation Artificial Rain, produced measurable precipitation where none had been forecast. More importantly, it worked reliably enough across multiple trials to convince Soviet leadership that large-scale weather modification was feasible. Nikita Khrushchev, always enthusiastic about technological solutions to Soviet problems, personally championed the program's expansion. In a 1959 speech to the Communist Party Central Committee, he proclaimed that our scientists will make rain fall where and when the Soviet people need it, transforming deserts into gardens and protecting our harvests from nature's whims. He allocated funds for an entire fleet of weather modification aircraft and established meteorological research stations across the USSR's 11 time zones. The Americans watched this expansion with growing concern. U-2 reconnaissance flights identified what CIA analysts called anomalous atmospheric research facilities near Vladivostok, Novosibirsk, and throughout Central Asia. A 1961 national intelligence estimate concluded that the USSR is conducting weather modification research on a scale unprecedented in human history, with potential military applications that remain unclear but concerning. Soviet scientists weren't just conducting research, they were creating an operational infrastructure. By 1963, the USSR had deployed specialized weather modification units across the country, equipped with aircraft, ground-based generators for silver iodide dispersal, and increasingly sophisticated radar systems for tracking atmospheric conditions. The Obninsk Institute alone employed over 700 scientists and technicians. Their mission expanded beyond simple cloud seeding to include hail suppression, fog dispersal, and what they termed precipitation redistribution, literally moving rainfall from one area to another. The military applications became apparent during Warsaw Pact exercises in 1965, when Soviet weather modification units successfully cleared fog over an airbase in Poland, allowing for simulated airstrikes that NATO forces tracking the exercise hadn't anticipated. A leaked report from the East German Stasi's Scientific Intelligence Division noted that Soviet meteorological warfare capabilities may include the ability to ground enemy aircraft, flood military installations, or deny precipitation to target regions. By the late 1960s, the Soviet program had become highly systematized. Weather modification units operated under the Council of Ministers Special Committee on Hydrometeorology, coordinating with military command, agricultural ministries, and even the KGB, which maintained strict security around the program's more sensitive aspects. Documents later declassified by the Russian Federation revealed that the Soviets maintained detailed records of over 40,000 weather modification operations between 1961 and 1975, ranging from small-scale hail suppression to massive attempts to enhance rainfall across entire Soviet republics. The program's ambitious scope reflected a fundamental Soviet confidence in humanity's ability to master nature through technology and central planning. Soviet scientists spoke openly about eventually controlling global weather patterns, redirecting Arctic air masses, and engineering the climate of entire continents. These weren't science fiction fantasies to them. They were the logical next steps in socialist science's triumph over nature's chaos. July 20, 1973, Obninsk Research Station, 110 kilometers southwest of Moscow. The morning staff meeting began with alarming news. Colonel General Viktor Mikhailovich Zhukov, head of the Military Meteorological Service, stood before a wall-sized map of the Western Soviet Union covered in red markings. "Comrades, we have a developing catastrophe," he announced. "American reconnaissance satellites have detected our weather modification operations. More critically, we are seeing unintended consequences that threaten to expose the program's limitations." The data was undeniable. Throughout the spring of 1973, aggressive weather modification operations intended to protect Ukrainian wheat harvests had successfully increased rainfall over target areas by 15 to 20%. But the atmospheric models hadn't accounted for downstream effects. Regions 200 to 300 kilometers east of the modification zones were experiencing severe droughts. Meteorologist Dr. Valentina Sergeyevna Ryabova had been warning about this for weeks. "We are not creating water from nothing. We are redistributing precipitation. Every drop that falls where we want it is a drop that doesn't fall somewhere else." The crisis deepened on August 3, 1973, when a particularly ambitious operation went catastrophically wrong. 6 aircraft had been deployed to seed clouds approaching Moldova, intending to protect vineyards from hail. The operation succeeded too well. What should have been a moderate rainstorm became a deluge. Within 4 hours, 180 millimeters of rain fell on the city of Kishinev, flooding the subway system under construction and causing 23 deaths. Soviet media attributed it to unprecedented natural weather phenomena, but internal reports told a different story. KGB intercepts revealed that Western intelligence agencies had connected the dots. A classified CIA memo from August 15, 1973, obtained through spy satellites monitoring Soviet communications traffic, noted, "Soviet weather modification operations appear operational but poorly controlled. Recent flooding in Moldova likely resulted from excessive cloud seeding. This suggests Soviet capabilities are less sophisticated than previously assessed. but their willingness to deploy these techniques at scale remains concerning. The political implications landed like a thunderbolt in the Kremlin. Leonid Brezhnev, facing pressure from agricultural ministers reporting ruined harvests in some regions and floods in others, demanded answers. At an emergency Politburo meeting on August 22nd, he confronted the program's leadership. "You promised me control over the weather. Instead, you have given me floods in one place and droughts in another. The Americans are laughing at us. Fix this or shut it down." But shutting down proved impossible. By 1973, Soviet agriculture and military planning had become dependent on weather modification operations. The program had expanded to include frost protection for citrus groves in Georgia, rainfall enhancement for cotton production in Uzbekistan, hail suppression across the wheat-producing regions, and fog dispersal at military airfields. Thousands of collective farm chairmen and military base commanders now routinely requested weather modification support. The infrastructure employed over 15,000 personnel. November 7, 1974, Red Square, Moscow. The annual October Revolution Parade provided the most public demonstration of Soviet weather modification and its most spectacular failure. For years, Soviet weather modification units had ensured clear skies over Red Square for the November 7th celebrations, a point of national pride. General Secretary Brezhnev would stand atop Lenin's mausoleum, reviewing military hardware under perfectly blue skies, while November typically brought gray clouds and rain to Moscow. The 1974 parade should have been routine. Weather modification aircraft began operations 48 hours in advance, seeding clouds approaching from the west to force premature precipitation. But a fast-moving cold front from Siberia wasn't in the forecast models. At 9:47 a.m., just as Brezhnev began his speech, freezing rain began falling on Red Square. Television cameras captured Soviet leaders huddling under umbrellas while tanks rolled past in increasingly muddy conditions. The public embarrassment paled beside the private catastrophe unfolding in the control center. The silver iodide deployed to clear the western clouds had supercooled the Siberian front, creating ice crystals that the atmosphere couldn't hold. Meteorologist Alexander Pavlovich Orlov watched his instruments in horror as he realized what was happening. We didn't just fail to stop the rain. We created it. We triggered the exact weather phenomenon we were trying to prevent. The incident crystallized growing doubts within the Soviet scientific community. At a closed-door conference in Leningrad on December 12, 1974, leading atmospheric scientists acknowledged that their models couldn't predict the cascading effects of large-scale weather modification. Dr. Mikhail Ivanovich Budiko, one of the USSR's most respected climatologists, delivered a damning assessment. "We have learned to trigger local weather events, but we cannot control the broader atmospheric consequences. We are playing with a system far more complex than we understood." The Americans, meanwhile, had their own reckoning. Operation Popeye, the secret weather modification program in Vietnam that seeded clouds to extend the monsoon season and impede North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, had become public in 1974. The resulting international outcry led to congressional hearings where military officials admitted they couldn't definitively prove the operations had worked as intended. Senator Claiborne Pell summarized the testimony. "We spent millions of dollars trying to control the weather in Southeast Asia, and we're not certain we achieved anything beyond making it rain slightly more than it already does during monsoon season." The mid-1970s marked a profound shift in both superpowers' approaches to weather modification. Rather than abandoning the programs entirely, both sides evolved toward more modest, targeted applications while pursuing international agreements to limit military weather warfare. American recalibration. Following the Vietnam revelations, the United States dramatically scaled back its weather modification ambitions. The Department of Defense issued Directive 5100.51 in 1975, requiring explicit presidential approval for any weather modification operations with potential military applications. Congress passed the National Weather Modification Policy Act of 1976, requiring all weather modification activities to be reported to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Dr. Thomas F. Malone, former president of the American Meteorological Society, captured the new American consensus in congressional testimony. Weather modification is scientifically possible within narrow parameters. But the atmosphere is too complex, too interconnected, for the kind of large-scale control both we and the Soviets have attempted. We must focus on understanding before we attempt manipulation. The CIA's assessment of Soviet capabilities also became more nuanced. A 1977 National Intelligence Estimate concluded, Soviet weather modification programs remain extensive, but appear focused increasingly on agricultural and civilian applications rather than military weather warfare. Their capabilities for localized precipitation enhancement and hail suppression appear genuine, though less controllable and reliable than Soviet public statements suggest. Soviet refinement. The Soviet response to the program's limitations took a different path. Rather than scaling back, they doubled down on improving their understanding and control systems. In 1976, the Council of Ministers established the All-Union Research Institute of Weather Modification, consolidating efforts under more rigorous scientific oversight. The new approach emphasized what Soviet scientists called defensive weather modification, protecting specific areas from adverse weather rather than attempting to create desired conditions across vast regions. This proved more achievable. By 1978, the USSR operated a comprehensive hail suppression network across major agricultural regions, claiming to protect over 3 million hectares of farmland. Independent Western analysis suggested these claims were only partially exaggerated. The Soviets had achieved genuine capability in this limited domain. Soviet weather modification units also perfected fog dispersal techniques for airports and military installations. Using ground-based liquid propane dispersal systems and aircraft-mounted silver iodide generators, they could reliably clear fog within 2 to 3 hours over areas of approximately 25 square kilometers. Colonel Pyotr Ivanovich Kovalev, commander of a weather modification squadron, explained the technique. We superheat the fog droplets, causing them to evaporate, or we seed them to form ice crystals that fall as light precipitation. It works because we're working with the atmosphere's natural tendencies, not fighting them. International diplomacy and secret competition. The growing concerns about weather warfare led to remarkable Cold War cooperation. The Environmental Modification Convention, ENMOD, negotiated between 1974 and 1976, prohibited military or hostile use of environmental modification techniques with widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The Soviet Union and United States were the primary architects, each side eager to limit the other's potential weather warfare capabilities while maintaining their own civilian programs. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko told the UN General Assembly in 1976, "The Soviet Union proposes this treaty not from weakness, but from strength, from the strength of our scientific achievements and from the wisdom to recognize that some competitions between nations should be prohibited entirely." It was ratified in 1978, though with significant loopholes allowing peaceful weather modification to continue. Behind the diplomatic niceties, both sides continued aggressive research. The Soviets maintained their massive weather modification infrastructure, conducting an estimated $8,000 to 10,000 operations annually throughout the late 1970s and 1980s. These ranged from small-scale agricultural protection to elaborate operations like ensuring clear skies for major political events, successfully after 1974, and supporting military exercises. Technological sophistication. By 1980, both superpowers had developed far more sophisticated approaches to weather modification. The Soviets deployed their first computer-based atmospheric modeling system, based on captured American technology, allowing better prediction of weather modification effects. Dr. Gennady Ivanovich Marchuk, director of the USSR's atmospheric modeling program, noted, "We now understand that the atmosphere is a chaotic system, but chaos has patterns. With sufficient computational power, we can identify brief windows where small interventions produce predictable results." The Americans pursued similar research through NOAA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Their focus shifted toward understanding climate systems rather than manipulating them. Though Project Skyfire continued experimenting with lightning suppression over sensitive military installations, and various agencies maintained weather modification capabilities for emergency response. The hidden costs by the early 1980s, accumulating evidence suggested that large-scale weather modification carried environmental costs that weren't initially apparent. Regions downwind of intensive Soviet weather modification operations showed altered precipitation patterns that persisted even when operations ceased. Agricultural yields in areas adjacent to protected zones sometimes declined, suggesting that the silver iodide and other chemicals used had unintended ecological effects. A leaked 1982 report from the Soviet Academy of Sciences Environmental Committee warned that 30 years of weather modification operations have potentially altered regional climate patterns in ways we are only beginning to understand. We may have created dependencies on continued intervention to maintain agricultural productivity in some areas. The report was classified, its conclusions deemed too sensitive for public discussion. April 26, 1986. Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Ukrainian SSR. The peak moment of Soviet weather modification capabilities came at their darkest hour. When Reactor 4 exploded at Chernobyl, sending radioactive material into the atmosphere, Soviet weather modification units were mobilized within hours for the most critical mission in the program's history, preventing radioactive clouds from reaching Moscow. Colonel Vladimir Grigorievich Nemtsov commanded the emergency weather modification operation. His orders were explicit: use every available technique to force premature precipitation from clouds containing radioactive particles before they reach the capital. For 3 days, his aircraft flew through radioactive clouds, seeding them with silver iodide to induce rainfall. The operation succeeded. Moscow was largely spared. But the rain fell instead on Belarus and rural Ukraine, spreading contamination across farmland and villages whose populations had no warning they were being deliberately subjected to radioactive precipitation. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev later acknowledged in his memoirs, "We faced an impossible choice. The weather modification units could force the radioactive clouds to rain out over rural areas, or we could allow them to continue toward Moscow. We chose to protect the capital. It was not a decision I made lightly, and I understand the moral weight of what we did." The Chernobyl weather modification operation represented both the program's greatest technical achievement and its most profound ethical failure. The meteorological teams had successfully redirected atmospheric flows at a scale previously thought impossible, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded Western intelligence estimates. But they had done so by deliberately contaminating populated areas to protect others, making concrete the abstract fears that had always surrounded weather modification as a potential weapon. The numbers tell the story. By 1986, the Soviet weather modification program had reached its operational peak. The military and civilian meteorological services employed over 25,000 personnel dedicated to atmospheric intervention. The annual budget exceeded 450 million rubles. The USSR operated 142 aircraft, permanently configured for weather modification, maintained 3,200 ground-based seeding stations, and conducted approximately 12,000 weather modification operations yearly across its territory. Soviet scientists claimed to protect 4.2 million hectares of agricultural land through hail suppression, with documented crop loss reductions of 60–80% in protected areas. They operated fog dispersal systems at 87 major airports and military air bases. During Gorbachev's tenure, weather modification operations ensured clear skies for every major state event, not just in Moscow, but across the USSR's major cities. The environmental accounting proved more troubling. Approximately 2,800 metric tons of silver iodide had been dispersed into Soviet airspace annually by the mid-1980s. Studies were beginning to show silver accumulation in soils and water systems. More significantly, atmospheric scientists documented measurable changes in regional precipitation patterns that couldn't be explained by natural climate variation alone. Western intelligence and parallel decline. American intelligence services watched the Soviet program's evolution with mixed feelings. A 1987 CIA assessment concluded, Soviet weather modification capabilities are real and extensive, but their usefulness as military weapons remains questionable. The Chernobyl operation demonstrated technical proficiency, but also revealed the ethical and practical limitations of weather manipulation at scale. The United States had largely abandoned operational weather modification by the mid-1980s. Hurricane modification experiments under Project Storm Fury had failed to demonstrate reliable results. Military weather modification capabilities, while maintained, were rarely deployed. The scientific consensus had shifted toward viewing the atmosphere as too complex for reliable manipulation beyond very localized, temporary interventions. Collapse and revelation. The Soviet weather modification program declined rapidly with the USSR itself. As Gorbachev's reforms took hold and budgets came under scrutiny, the massive weather modification infrastructure proved vulnerable. Agricultural ministers questioned whether the claimed crop protection justified the enormous costs. Military commanders pointed out that weather modification aircraft and personnel had limited utility beyond their specialized role. By 1990, annual weather modification operations had declined to fewer than 3,000. Many aircraft were mothballed or converted to other purposes. Ground stations were shuttered. The All-Union Research Institute of Weather Modification saw its staff reduced from 700 to fewer than 150. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the integrated weather modification network fragmented into poorly funded national programs, most of which ceased operations entirely within a few years. The post-Soviet revelations proved embarrassing for all parties. Russian scientists began publishing details of the program's limitations, failures, and environmental costs. It emerged that many of the claimed successes had been overstated. The Soviets had been better at weather modification than the Americans believed, but nowhere near as capable as Soviet propaganda suggested. They could influence local weather within limits, but the grand vision of controlling climate across continents had remained pure fantasy. The Soviet weather modification program stands as one of the Cold War's most ambitious technological overreaches. A case study in how superpower competition could drive nations to attempt mastery over domains that remained fundamentally beyond human control. The program's technical legacy proved mixed. Soviet scientists did advance atmospheric science significantly, developing cloud physics models and seeding techniques that influenced meteorology worldwide. The hail suppression methods pioneered in the USSR were adopted in modified form by over 40 countries. The fog dispersal techniques refined by Soviet military meteorologists remain in use at some airports today. But the broader legacy is cautionary. Documents released from Russian archives in the 2000s revealed that even at the program's peak, Soviet scientists privately harbored deep doubts about their capabilities. A 1985 internal review concluded that, while we can trigger certain weather events under favorable atmospheric conditions, we cannot reliably predict or control the broader consequences of our interventions. The gap between public claims and private doubts exemplified the Cold War's distorting effect on science. The environmental costs remain incompletely understood. Studies in the 2010s detected elevated silver concentrations in soils and water systems across regions where intensive weather modification occurred, though at levels generally below toxicity thresholds. More subtly, climatologists have identified persistent precipitation pattern anomalies in parts of the former Soviet Union that may reflect decades of atmospheric intervention, though natural climate variation makes definitive attribution impossible. The Chernobyl weather modification operation continues to provoke ethical debate. Did Soviet authorities make the right choice in forcing radioactive clouds to precipitate over rural areas? The consensus among bioethicists leans toward yes. Protecting Moscow's millions justified exposing thousands to elevated radiation, especially given that evacuation warnings could have been issued if authorities had been more transparent. But the incident exposed weather modification's potential as an inadvertent weapon, validating fears that had driven the NMOD treaty a decade earlier. For the United States, the Soviet program validated a strategic decision to limit weather modification ambitions. American atmospheric scientists concluded that the Soviets' extensive experimentation had effectively explored the boundaries of what was possible, and those boundaries were narrower than Cold War fears suggested. Weather could be influenced locally and temporarily, but not controlled reliably at strategic scales. The competition also illustrated how Cold War technological rivalries could drive both sides to pursue capabilities of questionable value. Billions of rubles and millions of dollars were devoted to weather modification programs that ultimately proved marginally useful at best. The resources might have been better allocated to understanding natural climate systems rather than attempting to dominate them. Today, as climate change renews interest in geoengineering and atmospheric intervention, the Soviet weather modification program offers sobering lessons. The atmosphere remains far more complex than our models suggest. Small-scale interventions produce cascading effects that are difficult to predict or control, and the gap between what is technically possible and what is practically useful or ethically acceptable remains vast. Lieutenant Colonel Lysenko, who had stood in that command center in 1977 watching his aircraft seed clouds, retired in 1989 as the program wound down. In an interview years later, he reflected, "We genuinely believed we could master the weather, bend it to our will through Soviet science and determination. We learned humility instead. Nature, we discovered, doesn't negotiate and doesn't care about 5-year plans. Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson, that some things remain beyond human control, no matter how much power you possess." The Soviet attempt to control the weather revealed a fundamental truth about the Cold War itself. In their obsession with demonstrating superiority, both superpowers pursued capabilities that existed more in imagination than reality. The weather, like history itself, would ultimately follow its own course, indifferent to the schemes of empires.